It was late November 1970, cold, damp, the kind of coastline weather that bites. A hiker and his 2 young daughters were walking near Mount Ulriken outside Bergen when they smelled smoke and found a body in Isdalen, Ice Valley, also known locally as Dødsdalen, Death Valley. The woman they found was badly burned on the front, partially stripped of clothing, surrounded by objects with their labels scraped off. It's a strange scene, Lucas. It doesn't read like an ordinary suicide or accident.
Yeah, Elena. Strange is exactly the word. The valley itself has that grim reputation. Suicides in the Middle Ages, hikers dying in the 1960s, so the terrain can encourage an assumption of self-harm, but the details here complicate that. There were suitcases left in the Bergen train station days later, wigs, multiple currencies, and a notepad with coded dates and city abbreviations. That pattern, erasing labels, multiple identities, is what makes investigators and historians look up from the grave and say, "This one looks like it was trying not to be found."
Right. Let me pause there. I want to pull a few hard facts into the light before we start surmising. The body was discovered on the morning of November 29, 1970. Forensic examiners estimated she was between 25 and 40 years old, about 1.63 meters tall, with dark brown hair and small brown eyes. Her lungs contained soot, meaning she was alive when the fire burned her, and toxicology showed an enormous dose of barbiturates, specifically phenobarbiturate. Those are the core physical truths we have.
Exactly. And to add, the autopsy concluded a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning and a barbiturate overdose as the cause of death. 50 to 70 sleeping pills were detected in her system, and there were another dozen found next to the body, phenymal, the barbiturate that turned up in the tests. But alongside that, there were worrying signs, like bruising on the neck and petrol traces on a fur hat beneath her body. It's the kind of mix that makes a suicide verdict plausible on paper, yet leaves a lot of investigators unconvinced in practice.
So, Lucas, when you hear bruising on the neck, petrol under the headwear, and carefully removed labels from clothing, what's your instinct as an historian and former analyst? Are these red flags of espionage tradecraft, or could they point to something else?
They are red flags, Elena, but they are not proof. Intelligence work often involves removing identifiers, labels, receipts, anything that traces back to you, or having a legend of cover identities. The Isdal woman had multiple passports and aliases that claimed she was Belgian, wigs, sunglasses, cash, maps, and a notepad coded with dates and places. Those are classic spy markers. Yet we must be cautious. Other illegal activities, black market antiquities, organized fraud, can show similar footprints. The context matters. Norway in 1970 was a NATO country on the northern flank of Europe with sensitive military testing. That makes the possibility of espionage more than idle speculation.
So context matters. Let's walk through that context carefully. Bergen, Stavanger, Oslo, those are the cities she traveled between. Police decoded a notepad found in her luggage which mapped dates to cities, and investigators reconstructed a travel pattern that included Paris, possibly Brussels, plus several Norwegian towns. She checked out of room 407 at Hotel Horteheimen on November 23rd, paid cash, and took a taxi to the railway station. That was the last confirmed hotel sighting. Short version, she was highly mobile.
And mobile in a deliberate way. The suitcases found at Bergen station 3 days after her body yielded wigs, clothes with labels removed, a pair of non-prescription glasses, shop bags from Paris and Stavanger, and 500 Deutschmark notes tucked in a lining. The gloves of anonymity were on her hands, figuratively speaking. One of the sunglasses actually matched the fingerprints preserved from the corpse, tiny threads linking the station luggage to the valley. But despite all that movement, her true identity vanished twice. First in life, through forged papers and covers, and again in death, when no one could be matched to her DNA or prints.
Twice vanished. Yes, that phrase has haunted the case. A point we should emphasize. Detectives removed her jaw and teeth, preserving them for future identification because her dental work was unusual. Gold fillings and patterns more typical of continental Europe, not Norway. Isotope analysis years later would suggest she grew up in central or southern Germany, maybe near Nuremberg, but for decades no one could place a name to those teeth. That's why the case has such a peculiar tension, specific physical clues, and yet no name.
Exactly. The dental evidence and later isotope results point towards Central Europe, while her covered identity papers often said Belgian. That mismatch alone raises questions. Was the Belgian nationality a deliberate false flag? In espionage, you sometimes wear the hat of another country because it gives you plausible access and fewer questions. Belgium is Western, movable, and not automatically suspect in the same way someone claiming to be from, say, the USSR would be.
Let's hold on to that. I want to talk about the discovery scene at Isdalen. The way journalists and police described objects arranged around a body, a broken umbrella, jewelry fragments, a matchbox, a plastic passport holder, empty bottles, including St. Halvard liqueur. Several observers later said the scene looked staged, the items seemed deliberately placed. Lucas,
When items appear arranged, it could mean many things. It could be an attempt to remove identifying markers and to stage a death as self-inflicted, or it could be ritual or signaling. Intelligence hits, if they are messages, tend to be subtle and aimed at a specific audience, not random passers-by. But this scene might also represent someone who wanted to make sure nothing tied back, labels scraped, tags cut out, the passport holder empty. The staging suggests someone who understood how to erase traces, or someone trying to make the death readable in a very specific, ambiguous way.
That ambiguity is central, isn't it? On paper, the Norwegian police concluded likely suicide, barbiturates, fire, Death Valley's reputation. But the official line leaves room for doubt. A botched operation, a staged scene, or a ritualistic disposal. I want to press you, Lucas. Given the Cold War environment, NATO bases, missile testing like the Penguin anti-ship system being tested nearby, how plausible is it that intelligence services were involved in either surveilling her or silencing her?
Plausible, but not proven. There are circumstantial clues. Her movements coincided with some classified testing windows. A Stavanger fisherman reported seeing a woman resembling her near a missile test area. Agents operating illegally, deep-cover KGB operatives, would move with forged documents and speak multiple languages. But Western intelligence also had assets in Scandinavia. Without a smoking gun, wiretaps, a defecting operative naming her, internal memos, we can only say the espionage hypothesis fits patterns. It's a model that explains a lot, but it's still a model.
Model, right. And models have limits. I want to read out a small, concrete timeline because the gaps matter. November 23rd, she leaves the hotel in Bergen. Between the 23rd and the 29th, we lose direct tracking. On the 29th, her body is found. 3 days later, the suitcases are found in the station locker. During those days, a Bergen man would later say he saw a woman like her on Mount Floyen, followed by 2 southern-looking men. He says he tried to tell police but was told to forget it. That's the kind of thing that makes people suspect official suppression.
That Floyen testimony is painful because it suggests witnesses were not fully pursued. If police did indeed urge forgetfulness, it might reflect a lack of interest, or it could, speculatively, suggest pressure to avoid probing certain leads. We have to be careful assigning motive, though. Institutional caution and bureaucracy can look like cover-up without being consciously sinister. Still, for families, or for us, those unasked questions feel like obstruction.
bureaucracy sometimes reads like indifference. Another detail I want listeners to hear: when the suitcases were opened, the items inside had brand labels removed, and there were multiple wigs and non-prescription glasses, disguises. There were also city timetables and a notepad, which turned out not to be a sophisticated cipher, but rather a personal shorthand, dates linked to cities. That gave police the movement map: Oslo, Trondheim, Stavanger, Bergen, and evidence of several continental trips. Lucas, what does that kind of documentation tell you about the woman's operational tradecraft?
It tells me she or her handlers understood compartmentation. Simple shorthand is a classic way to keep a log that's meaningful only to you. Wigs, glasses, cash payments, and stripped labels suggest a practiced regimen of anonymity. It's not the flashy spycraft of movies, it's the mundane, disciplined pattern of daily concealment. Avoid long phone records, pay cash, change appearance. That level of operational hygiene is consistent with trained intelligence assets, but again, professionals in other illicit trades use identical methods.
Okay, let's talk about the isotopes and the exhumation, hard science. In 2016, Bergen police exhumed the body. They'd buried her in a zinc coffin on purpose to allow later analysis. NRK and the BBC's Death in Ice Valley brought forensic reconstructions by Stephen Müller. An isotope analysis suggested she grew up in central or southern Germany, possibly Bavaria. Yet DNA and fingerprints still didn't match international databases. How do these modern methods change the conversation, Lucas?
They change it in two ways. First, they narrow geography. Isotope signatures in teeth and bones provide hard clues about childhood drinking water and diet, so pointing to Central Europe is a real advancement. Second, they show the limits of our databases. Someone can have a unique life and still leave no match. Even now, degraded DNA can be hard to work with, and if she spent her life under false names, she never appeared in the registries that would make a match probable. So science sharpens the picture, but doesn't necessarily give us a name.
And there's something human in that gap. A woman with precise dental work, well-groomed hands, no evidence of hard manual labor, and yet no family or missing persons report that fits. There are reports, years later, of a man from Forbach, France, who said he had a relationship with a polyglot woman in 1970 who refused to share personal details, kept wigs, and received international calls at set times. He suspected she might be a spy. That's the sort of witness that can't be discounted. Lucas, does anecdotal testimony like that hold up for historians, or is it just noise?
It's neither wholly reliable nor negligible. First-hand memories after decades can be distorted, but they often contain kernels of truth. The Forbach story aligns with other clues: polyglot behavior, wigs, and secrecy. In intelligence research, corroboration matters. When multiple independent anecdotes point the same way, they become stronger. We can't treat them as conclusive, but we do treat them as additional angles that triangulate the woman's habits and likely role.
Triangulation. Good term. Let me throw a classic counter-argument at you, Lucas. Critics of the spy theory point out that if intelligence services wanted to silence someone, they wouldn't leave a body in a place where hikers would find it and trigger a major investigation. They argue state actors usually prefer cleaner, deniable methods. How do we reconcile that?
There are three plausible reconciliations. One, it was a botched operation. Something went wrong and urgency forced a messy disposal. Two, it was meant to be visible, either as a warning or to create a particular narrative, a message to a specific community. Three, she engineered her own death in a way designed to destroy her identity. State hits are often designed for deniability, true, but not always. The inconvenient truth is that messy outcomes do happen, even in clandestine work.
Messy outcomes, yeah. I want to examine the gendered frame here for a moment. Historically, police and media sometimes labeled solitary women in mysterious circumstances as housewives, or worse, folded them into stigmatized categories that obscured real evidence. The Isdal woman listed her occupation as housewife on some registrations, which clashes with her travel patterns and the quality of her dental care. Lucas, as a historian, how does gender bias affect the interpretation of cases like this?
It affects them a lot. In 1970, social scripts about women, expectations of domesticity, could easily lead investigators to dismiss a woman's extensive travel as eccentricity or to assume mental instability rather than professional intent. If a male corpse showed the same passport anomalies and international travel, authorities might more readily think spy than suicidal housewife or prostitute. Gendered bias can skew both the initial investigation and long-term public narratives. We must read the old records with that in mind.
That's an important lens. Now, let's pivot to the cultural afterlife of the case. The Norwegian police gave her a Catholic burial in an unmarked grave, attended by 16 officers. NRK and BBC later produced Death in Ice Valley, which reignited public interest, brought facial reconstructions into circulation, and prompted the 2016 exhumation. This public attention changes the story from a local mystery to an international puzzle. Lucas, what does that media revival do to a cold case like this?
It does two things. First, it crowdsources memory. People who never spoke up before might come forward with late testimonies, and social media can amplify small tips into new leads. Second, it invites reinterpretation. Journalists and forensic artists reframe evidence with modern sensibilities. That can generate breakthroughs, but it can also produce noise and speculative narratives that feel satisfying but aren't strongly grounded. Still, the exhumation and isotope work were clear benefits of renewed attention.
Let's present listeners with the competing theories clearly, because part of our job is to keep evidence and speculation distinct. Theory 1. Suicide. Heavy dose of barbiturates, fire, and the valley's history of self-harm. Theory 2. Homicide. Someone incapacitated her, staged the scene, removed labels, and left her maybe as a message. Theory 3. Espionage. She was an intelligence operative, perhaps a KGB illegal or a Western asset, and her travel and disguises were part of that life. Theory 4. Involvement in other illicit activities, like fraud or antiquities trading. Lucas, which theory best fits the totality of evidence?
If you asked for a probabilistic ranking, I'd say espionage explanation best fits the pattern of multiple identities, travel to sensitive areas, and deliberate erasure of labels, though it's not proven. Homicide is plausible because of neck bruising and staging. Suicide remains possible given the pill overdose and soot in the lungs. The other illicit activities are less convincing, but not impossible. The honest answer is this: espionage is the hypothesis that explains the most anomalies simultaneously, but it still lacks direct proof.
Very measured. That's why I wanted you here. Now, let me ask a thorny ethical question before we go to a short break. If anonymity was, on some level, the woman's project, if she chose to live outside records, do we, decades later, violate that choice by insisting she be named and fitted into a narrative? Or do we owe her identification as a matter of dignity? Lucas, where do you land on that?
It's a complicated moral intuition. On one hand, respecting a person's choice to remain anonymous can be ethically defensible. On the other hand, when a person dies like this, without family contact, buried in an unmarked grave, there's an argument that restoring their name is about restoring their humanity. Investigative work aims to replace mystery with dignity, a name, a history, a context. I tend to favor identification, assuming the work is done responsibly and without sensationalism.
I agree. Identification confers a kind of moral citizenship that case numbers don't. We'll take a moment here and when we come back, I want to trace some specific leads. The Stavanger boot shop evidence, the Floyan sighting, the penguin missile test coincidences, and the exhumation results in more detail. Lucas, anything you want to flag before we pause?
Just this. Listen for patterns rather than single facts. The rubber boots purchased in Stavanger, the shop bags from Paris, and the train tickets together create a motion picture. A person who moved deliberately. Keep that picture in mind. I'll be ready to unpack those elements after the break.
Great. Stay with us.
Welcome back. Lucas, let's look at that footwear clue, because it's unexpectedly concrete. A Stavanger shoe shop employee remembered a woman trying on rubber boots and returning the next day to buy them, a size 38, and those burnt boots matched what was found near the body. That's a small anchor in a sea of fog. What does a mundane purchase like that reveal?
It reveals movement and continuity. Small retail transactions anchor a person to a place and time. They are the forensic breadcrumbs investigators love because they are hard to fake and mass. People forget receipts, but they don't always forget buying a specific pair of boots. In this case, that shop record ties her activity to Stavanger shortly before Bergen. It undermines the idea that she was only passing through at random and suggests planning, either for a route that required boots or for an appearance that needed particular footwear.
Yes, planning, or at least intention. Now, the Floyan witness claimed she was accompanied by two southern-looking men who followed her. He says he tried to tell police and was asked to forget. We talked earlier about how that could be bureaucratic indifference or something more. What's the investigative consequence of ignoring a witness like that, Lucas?
The consequence is the loss of contemporaneous corroboration. A witness account collected immediately can be cross-checked with others, can identify taxis, faces, and timelines. If it's ignored, later attempts to reconstruct the same memory are always weaker. Whether it was deliberate suppression or negligence, the practical outcome is that a potentially crucial piece of the chain of movement remains unverified, and that increases the number of plausible narratives you can hang on the case.
Understood. Now, about the penguin missile tests. Investigative journalists found that some of her recorded movements align with classified test windows. A fisherman claimed to have seen a woman like her near the test area. We can't overstate any single piece, but as you said earlier, the triangulation becomes persuasive. If she was watching military activity, what would that imply about her sponsors or handlers?
It implies she, or whoever deployed her, had an intelligence target, observation, photography, or reporting on technical performance. That could be consistent with Soviet intelligence trying to learn about NATO capabilities, or with Western intelligence probing adversary attention to tests. The key point, interest in missile testing signals a political or military motive rather than merely financial criminality. It raises the stakes and broadens the list of agencies that might care about her presence.
Okay, now let's talk about the notepad and the code. Police decoded simple shorthand, dates, and city abbreviations. Some retellings mention names like Müller as thematic devices, though the official files don't present a documented Müller note. How should listeners think about small narrative inventions like that when they enter the Isdal story?
They should treat them as storytelling shorthand rather than evidence. Names like Müller are evocative, Germanic, common, and they carry symbolic weight when you're trying to dramatize anonymity. But the only coded material documented in the files was a simple travel log. As a historian, I appreciate evocative names for framing, but we must keep them separate from the primary record. Otherwise, fiction creeps into history and obscures the facts.
Good clarification. Moving forward, 2016 exhumation. The body had been buried in a zinc coffin to preserve potential future forensic work. That foresight paid off. Isotopes and facial reconstructions were possible. NRK commissioned Stephen Müller and produced multiple sketches that were circulated widely to crowdsourcing efforts. That's an example of combining science and public engagement, right?
Yes, and it shows the strengths and limits of public forensic tools. Facial reconstructions can prompt recognition from eyewitnesses or people who knew her, and isotope analysis gives a probabilistic origin. But reconstructions are by definition approximations and can generate false leads if people take slight resemblances as definitive. Still, the exhumation and modern science did push the investigation forward in a way the 1970s technology could not.
Right. And despite those efforts, the DNA and fingerprints still yielded no matches in Interpol and European police databases. That underscores your earlier point about the limits of databases. There were later testimonies, like the Forbach man, and journalistic claims hinting at possible intelligence interference by Norwegian agencies, but none of those are conclusive, so we circle back to uncertainty.
Exactly. The picture grows richer with each piece of evidence, but the final frame, her identity, her allegiances, remains blank. That blank is what attracts speculation, and why the Isdal woman fits into a larger class of 20th century ghost cases. Somerton Man in Australia, Jennifer Fairgate in Oslo, Peter Bergman, all of them show the state's blind spots and the human urge to close gaps in stories.
And that human urge, our need for narrative closure, can sometimes push us to overread patterns. Which is why, Lucas, I want to ask, what would be the single piece of evidence that would transform the Isdal case from mystery to solved? A name on a document? A handler's confession? A matching family DNA sample?
A documented link between her preserved biological material and a living relative, or a direct match in a robust database, would be transformative. It would give a name and a background, allow police to trace passport issuances, and possibly unearth travel records connected to a real identity. A confession from an intelligence handler would also be decisive, but those are rare. In practical terms, a DNA match to a family member is the most likely route to convert mystery into biography.
So the search continues, mostly in archives and on gene databases. Before we head to the last segment, a quick lighter note. Witnesses at the hotel remembered her as aloof, smelling of garlic, speaking broken English, possibly Flemish, and sometimes German. Little human traits like those make her less like a cipher and more like a person. Lucas, do small sensory details like smell and manner give us anything useful beyond atmosphere?
They do. Sensory details can point to habits, diet, or cultural background. Garlic, for instance, is more common in some cuisines, though it's hardly deterministic. Broken English and German suggest multilingualism, which aligns with the spy or international traveler profile. These details humanize her and provide additional nodes for cross-checking testimony. If multiple independent witnesses report the same distinctive trait, it strengthens the likelihood they saw the same person.
They do. All right, we're into the final stretch. Let's pull together the lessons and the lingering questions. First, the facts. Found November 29th, 1970 in Isdalen. Heavy barbiturate levels and inhaled smoke. Belongings stripped of labels. Multiple passports and aliases claiming Belgian nationality. Last confirmed hotel checkout on November 23rd. Suitcase contents linking to Paris and Stavanger. Isotopes suggesting central southern Germany origins. Exhumation in 2016. No DNA match to date. Anything essential I missed, Lucas?
You covered the essentials. I just underscored the suitcases being found 3 days later in the Bergen station locker, and the remarkable detail that the police preserved her jaw and teeth specifically, because the dental work, gold fillings, and other continental signatures were distinctive. Those small procedural choices mattered for later forensic work.
Good. Thank you. Second, the interpretive landscape. Espionage explains many anomalies, but lacks direct proof. Homicide is possible given the bruising and staging. Suicide is supported by the overdose and soot in lungs, but doesn't fully account for the meticulous removal of identity markers. Third, the ethical question. We want to identify her to restore dignity, but we also must be careful not to sensationalize. Final question for you, Lucas. If you had one message for listeners who hear this and want to help, what would it be?
If you have a memory or documentary material, hotel receipts, photographs, letters, come forward to the appropriate police channels or trusted journalists. Don't invent details. Provide what you truly remember or possess. Cold cases often move from public curiosity to resolution when someone produces an overlooked piece of paper or a photograph tucked in an album. Small, verifiable things beat grand speculation.
Actionable and humble. That's a good note to end on. The Isdal woman remains a study in the limits of our records and the potency of deliberate anonymity. She traveled, she removed her marks, and she died in a place called Death Valley that seems to have been chosen, or became, famous for the question she left behind. Lucas, thank you for keeping us grounded in the methods and the context.
Thanks, Elena. It's been a privilege to think through this with you. Cases like this remind us how much history is lived in the margins and how much decoding we still have to do.
If you want to read more, our show notes link to NRK's Death in Ice Valley, the Wikipedia summary on the Isdal woman, and a few journalistic pieces that dove into the suitcases, the Stavanger connection, and the exhumation. We'll also list where to submit credible evidence if you have it. Before we sign off, one last small thought. She might have wanted to vanish, but because we keep asking, she hasn't been forgotten. That in itself is a kind of accountability.
Yeah. She vanished twice, but she still haunts our records, and that gives us a responsibility, I think, to continue with rigor and respect.
Thank you, Lucas. And thank you, listeners. This is Still Unanswered, where some puzzles remain unsolved, but the asking matters. Until next time, take care.
Good night.